By dawn, the Apache camp was empty, and the only thing that remained was silence, so heavy it felt like it had weight in the air, pressing down on Luke Mercer as he stood in the middle of his ranch yard with the morning wind cutting across the open land. He had seen storms roll in from the west. He had seen cattle scatter across dry fields. But he had never seen silence like this, deliberate, complete, unnatural. The Apache visitors who had shared his fire the night before were gone without a single word, without tracks that made sense, without even the sound of horses breaking the distance, as if the land itself had decided to forget they were ever there. Luke's hand tightened around the edge of the wooden fence when he noticed something strange tied to the post in front of him. A small leather bracelet, worn and weathered, not new, not accidental, placed with intention. His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, the morning light catching on the braided leather, and that was when he saw it carved into the wood beneath it. His daughter Emily's initials, shallow but clear, as if someone wanted him to find them before the wind erased them. Luke's breath slowed, not in fear, but in confusion, because Emily had been inside the house last night, safe, or at least she had been when he last checked before midnight, and now the world felt like it had shifted while he wasn't looking. A ranch hand approached from the barn, stopping a few feet away as if unsure whether to speak or stay silent, and when he finally did, his voice carried the kind of uncertainty that made Luke's stomach tighten. "They didn't take anything," the man said quietly, glancing toward the treeline where the Apache camp had stood. "They just left." Luke didn't answer right away. Instead, his mind drifted back to Chief Noah White Elk, the man who had arrived days earlier with calm eyes and a presence that never asked for permission, only understanding. Luke remembered offering water to the injured chief by the river, a simple act he hadn't thought twice about at the time, something small enough to forget. But nothing about the Apache tribe had felt ordinary since then. They had spoken little, watched more, and moved like they were always listening to something Luke couldn't hear. Now that same silence had returned, but heavier, as if it carried meaning he had not yet learned to read. Luke reached for his horse, his movements steady but slower than usual, because something in him refused to believe this was random, refused to accept that a group of people who had shared food and fire would simply vanish without reason. As he rode out toward the edge of the canyon, the ground shifting beneath hooves and dust rising in thin trails behind him, he noticed something that made him pull the reins tighter. Faint tracks leading away from the river, not scattered in panic, but aligned with intention, as if following a path only they could see. And then, hanging from a branch at eye level, he saw it, a single Apache feather tied with precision, swaying gently in the wind, not as a warning, but as a direction. Luke stared at it longer than he should have, because deep down he understood something he could not yet explain. The tribe had not disappeared from fear, nor from conflict, but from purpose, and whatever that purpose was, it was already moving ahead of him, just beyond the edge of what he could still see. Luke Mercer rode deeper into the canyon with the morning sun now climbing higher, casting long shadows across the uneven ground, and every mile he traveled seemed to pull him further away from certainty and closer to something he could not yet name. The feather tied to the branch behind him was still in his mind, not as decoration but as direction, and the more he followed the faint trail, the more it felt like whoever had left it wanted to be followed. The air grew cooler as he descended, carrying the scent of dry stone and distant water, and his horse slowed slightly as the path narrowed between rock walls that seemed to close in like silent witnesses. Luke scanned the terrain carefully, noticing how the tracks were not chaotic as he first expected, but instead deliberate, spaced evenly, as if the group had moved with purpose rather than urgency. At one point, he found a small patch of ground where the soil had been smoothed over, not by chance but by intention, and beside it rested another object, a strip of fabric tied to a stone, marked with the same simple symbol he had seen near the river weeks ago, when Chief Noah White Elk had first arrived injured and alone. Luke dismounted slowly, crouching beside it, his fingers hovering over the symbol without touching it at first, as if afraid it might disappear if disturbed. It was not a warning, he realized, but a sign of passage, a way of saying they had been here and had moved forward safely. A ranch hand who had followed him partway from the homestead caught up after several minutes, breathing heavily as he looked around the canyon with uncertainty. "Something does not feel right about this," the man said quietly, glancing at the narrow passage ahead. But Luke only nodded because he already felt it too. Not fear exactly, but the sensation of being outside a plan he did not understand. As they moved forward again, Luke's thoughts drifted back to Emily, wondering when he had last truly seen her, not just checked on her presence in the house, but spoken to her, and the realization unsettled him more than the empty Apache camp ever had. The canyon widened slightly, revealing a shallow stream cutting through the stone, and along its edge Luke noticed footprints again, but this time smaller, inconsistent with the larger tracks he had been following, and that contradiction made him pause. He knelt near the water, studying the impressions carefully, noticing how some belonged to adults moving in steady formation, while others suggested a child walking alongside them willingly rather than being carried or dragged, and that detail shifted something inside him. If this was not an abduction, then it was something far more structured, something guided. Further along the stream, Luke discovered a second resting point, this one marked by a circle of stones arranged with precision, inside which lay remnants of a camp that had been broken down recently, not abandoned in panic but cleared with care, as if the people who had stayed there intended to leave no trace of themselves behind. There were signs of fire that had been fully extinguished, water skins neatly emptied, and paths marked outward in 3 different directions, each one subtle enough to confuse anyone following without understanding the system. Luke stood for a long moment, realizing the Apache tribe had not vanished randomly, but had divided themselves strategically, as if responding to a threat that required them to disappear into the land rather than confront it directly. His ranch hand shifted uneasily beside him, suggesting they return, but Luke remained focused on a single detail he could not ignore. One of the paths led not deeper into Apache territory, but toward the old hunting grounds where traveling traders occasionally passed, men known more for opportunity than mercy. As the wind moved through the canyon, Luke noticed something else carved into the stone near the trail split, a symbol repeated twice, simple yet intentional, and it matched the marking on the fabric he had found earlier. He traced it lightly with his eyes, understanding now that each clue was not random, but part of a communication meant for someone specific, someone the tribe believed would eventually follow. And as Luke mounted his horse again, he could no longer dismiss the growing truth forming in his mind. The silence left behind by the Apache tribe was not absence at all, but a carefully constructed message, and whatever had caused them to scatter across the land had already placed Emily at the center of something far larger than a disappearance. The canyon stretched deeper than Luke Mercer expected, as if the land itself was narrowing his choices and forcing him to see only what it wanted him to see. And by the time the sun reached its highest point, the silence around him no longer felt empty, but carefully arranged, like a story written in dust and stone. Every step forward carried him further into a pattern he was beginning to recognize, where nothing was random and every mark on the ground seemed placed with intention. He followed the stream until it bent sharply around a cluster of rocks, and there he found another symbol etched into the stone surface, the same marking he had seen twice before, now repeated with greater clarity, as if confirming that he was on the correct path rather than warning him away. Luke dismounted slowly, his boots pressing into the soft ground near the water, and for a long moment he simply listened, not for danger, but for meaning, because everything about this silence suggested communication rather than absence. His ranch hand stood a few yards back, shifting his weight uneasily, glancing toward the narrow canyon opening ahead where the trail disappeared between 2 towering rock faces. But Luke's attention remained fixed on the symbol, tracing its lines in his mind, as if trying to translate something written in a language he almost understood. Then, just beyond the bend of the stream, he noticed something that changed the rhythm of his thoughts. A series of evenly spaced stones forming a faint boundary line, not natural, not accidental, but carefully placed to guide movement through the terrain. Luke followed the line with his eyes and realized it extended toward a hidden passage, one that would not be visible unless you were already standing exactly where he was. He hesitated for the first time, not because he feared what lay ahead, but because he understood that stepping forward meant accepting that everything he believed about the Apache tribe's disappearance might be wrong. The ranch hand called out softly, suggesting again that they turn back, but Luke raised his hand slightly, signaling silence, because he had begun to notice something else. The trail markings were not only directional, they were protective, designed to move travelers away from certain areas and toward others with precision. As he advanced, the air grew still again, and the canyon walls reflected the sound of his footsteps in a way that made it impossible to tell how far ahead the path truly went. Then, without warning, Luke found himself standing at the edge of a wider basin where the ground opened into a quiet natural bowl surrounded by stone, and at its center lay another carefully arranged pattern of objects, not abandoned, but intentionally placed. Among them was a strip of fabric matching the one he had seen earlier, and beside it, a small wooden carving shaped like a simple horse, worn smooth by time and handling. Luke picked it up, slowly, turning it in his hand, and something in his expression shifted because he recognized it as something that would not be left behind without meaning. The ranch hand finally stepped closer, voice lower now, asking what it could mean. But Luke did not answer immediately because he was beginning to understand that every sign he had followed was not pointing to a destination, but to a reason. The Apache tribe had not simply moved through the land. They had been arranging a path, guiding anyone who followed toward a truth that was still unfolding ahead of them. And as Luke looked deeper into the basin, where a second trail disappeared into a shadowed passage between rocks, he realized that whatever had caused the tribe to scatter had also required them to leave behind a message carefully constructed for someone who would eventually be forced to understand it. And that someone, he was beginning to suspect, had been chosen long before he ever set foot in this canyon. The deeper Luke Mercer moved into the canyon basin, the more the landscape began to feel less like open land and more like a hidden corridor designed with intention, as if every stone and shadow had been placed to guide him toward a truth that refused to reveal itself all at once. The wooden carving of the horse he held in his hand felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, but in meaning, as if it carried a memory attached to someone he had not yet fully remembered. The ranch hand walked a few steps behind him now, quieter than before, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a growing awareness that the path they were following was not random exploration but structured guidance. Luke stopped near the center of the basin where the ground dipped slightly and the wind softened, and there he noticed a second arrangement of stones forming a wider circle, more deliberate than the previous ones, with gaps aligned in a way that suggested direction rather than decoration. Inside the circle lay additional objects, a strip of fabric tied neatly to a smooth stone, a carved symbol repeated again in a more refined pattern, and faint impressions in the soil indicating that people had stood here recently but, without urgency or fear, Luke knelt slowly, placing the wooden horse carving near the edge of the circle, and as he did, he felt an uneasy shift in his understanding because these signs did not belong to a fleeing group, but to a coordinated system of movement and communication. The ranch hand finally spoke again, voice low, suggesting that whoever created this network of signs must have known the land intimately, perhaps better than anyone traveling through it blindly ever could. Luke did not disagree, but his attention remained fixed on the way the symbols seemed to align not only with geography, but with timing, as if each mark was placed to be discovered at a specific moment by a specific person. Then, from the far edge of the basin, Luke noticed a narrow passage leading upward between two stone formations, partially concealed by natural shadow, and along its entrance were faint markings that matched the earlier symbols but in reverse orientation, suggesting a return path or a completion point. He hesitated, sensing that this was not simply another trail but the final segment of a route that had been carefully constructed to lead to understanding rather than destination. As he stepped closer, the wind shifted gently through the canyon, carrying with it a faint sound that made him pause, a soft rhythmic movement, not speech, not alarm, but something like coordinated motion hidden just beyond the ridge. Luke raised his hand slightly, signaling the ranch hand to remain still, and in that moment the entire basin felt suspended, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He studied the entrance more carefully and noticed something he had missed before, small notches carved into the stone at regular intervals, too precise to be natural erosion, forming a subtle pattern that pointed inward rather than outward. It was then that Luke realized the truth forming slowly in his mind was not about disappearance at all, but about orchestration, a deliberate decision to move unseen while leaving behind only enough evidence for the right observer to piece together. The wooden horse carving in his hand now felt like part of a larger language, and as he looked between the objects arranged within the stone circle and the hidden passage ahead, he understood that each clue had been placed to prepare him for a final truth still waiting beyond his sight line. And as he stood at the edge of the shadowed entrance, Luke could no longer believe that he had been following empty trails, because everything he had seen so far suggested that the Apache tribe had not vanished into the land, but had instead become part of it, guiding him step by step towards something that had been waiting for him long before he ever chose to follow. Luke Mercer stepped into the narrow passage between the stone formations, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the world behind him seemed to quiet even further, as if the canyon itself was sealing off the space he had just left in order to focus his attention forward. The air inside the passage was cooler, still, and carried a faint scent of dust and wood smoke that did not belong to the open land outside. Each step he took echoed softly against the stone walls, but the sound felt controlled, almost absorbed, as though the canyon was listening rather than reflecting. The ranch hand followed closely, staying near the edge of the passage, his movements careful, his earlier confidence replaced by a cautious silence that mirrored Luke's own growing awareness that they were no longer simply following tracks, but entering a guided route. Luke held the carved wooden horse in his hand, and now it felt less like an object and more like a marker confirming that he was still on the correct path, each symbol and arrangement of stones behind him forming part of a system that extended deeper into the canyon. As they advanced, Luke noticed subtle changes in the walls. Small carved lines at intervals, not random scratches, but consistent markings spaced at equal distances, forming a rhythm that suggested communication rather than decoration. He paused briefly to study one of these markings, noticing that it aligned with the position of the sun filtering down through a narrow gap above, and for a moment he realized that whoever created this system understood the land with precise familiarity, using natural light and geography as part of their message. The passage began to widen gradually, revealing a second basin ahead, partially shaded, where the ground leveled out and the wind returned in faint, controlled currents that carried movement without chaos. Luke slowed again, sensing that this was not another waypoint, but a transition point, and as he stepped into the basin, he saw that the ground was marked with multiple overlapping paths, each one carefully shaped by foot traffic that followed deliberate patterns rather than random travel. In the center of this space lay another arrangement of stones forming a spiral instead of a circle, and within that spiral were objects placed with even greater care than before, strips of fabric tied at precise angles, small carved symbols repeated in sequence, and shallow impressions in the soil, suggesting repeated gatherings rather than a single passing group. Luke knelt at the edge of the spiral and traced the pattern with his eyes, realizing that it was not only directional, but chronological, as if each layer represented a different stage of movement through the canyon. The ranch hand stepped closer, his voice low and uncertain, asking if Luke believed this was still the same group they had been tracking, and Luke answered slowly that it could not be random, because no group fleeing in fear would leave behind such structured signs. Then Luke noticed something that tightened the focus of his attention. One section of the spiral pointed directly toward a narrow opening in the far rock wall, partially hidden by shadow and elevation, and unlike the previous passages, this one had no outward markers, only inward guidance. As he stood, the carved wooden horse in his hand suddenly felt aligned with the direction of that opening, as if it had always been meant to point him here, and Luke began to understand that each object he had found was not a clue left behind carelessly, but part of a system designed to ensure he would reach this exact moment of realization. The ranch hand shifted uneasily behind him, suggesting again that they should return before nightfall, but Luke kept his gaze fixed on the shadowed opening because something about it felt final, not in danger, but in meaning. The canyon around them remained still, but it was no longer empty. It felt occupied by intention, by memory, and by a presence that existed only through the signs left behind. And as Luke Mercer stood at the edge of the spiral marking, looking toward the hidden passage that seemed to draw him forward without sound or force, he understood that every step he had taken so far had not been toward disappearance, but toward revelation, and whatever waited beyond that opening was not the end of a search, but the beginning of understanding what had truly been happening in the silence all along. Luke Mercer stood at the edge of the narrow opening in the canyon wall, the carved wooden horse still resting in his hand, and for a long moment he did not move because the air itself felt different here, heavier in meaning rather than weight, as if the passage ahead was not simply stone and shadow but a threshold that required understanding before entry. Behind him, the ranch hand shifted uneasily, but Luke's attention was fixed forward where the darkness inside the opening did not feel empty, only waiting. He took a slow step inside, and the sound of his boots softened immediately, absorbed by the narrow walls that guided him forward in a straight, deliberate line. The further he went, the more the canyon seemed to close around him, not trapping him, but focusing him, removing distraction until only the path remained. Carved markings appeared again at shoulder height, more frequent now, forming a continuous sequence rather than isolated symbols, and Luke realized they were not random signs, but part of a structured language built into the stone itself. Each mark repeated variations of the same pattern he had seen outside, but here they were refined, consistent, as if this section of the canyon was the final instruction rather than the beginning. The ranch hand's footsteps faded slightly behind him, and Luke knew the man was still following but at a greater distance, hesitant to enter deeper without certainty. Luke continued forward until the passage opened into a smaller chamber shaped like a natural corridor, where light from above filtered in through narrow cracks in the rock, creating thin beams that illuminated the ground in segmented lines. And in those lines of light, Luke saw the most structured arrangement yet, not scattered objects, not resting points, but a complete path drawn through placement alone, formed by stones, fabric strips, and carved markers that pointed toward a single direction at the far end of the chamber. He moved closer slowly, his eyes tracing the alignment, and he realized that every previous symbol had been guiding him not just through space, but through a sequence of understanding, each step removing one assumption and replacing it with something more precise. The carved wooden horse in his hand now matched the direction of the final alignment without doubt, as if it had been shaped for this exact moment, and Luke felt a tightening in his chest not from fear, but from recognition that the message was nearing completion. The ranch hand finally stepped into the chamber behind him, his voice low, saying that there was something unnatural about how organized everything felt, as if people had planned every movement with full awareness of those who might follow. Luke did not respond immediately, because he had begun to see something else beyond the arrangement. Faint impressions in the dust showing that groups had paused here, not in panic, but in coordinated timing, suggesting that whoever had traveled this path had done so with purpose and discipline. At the far end of the chamber, Luke noticed a final opening, wider than the previous passage, framed naturally by stone that curved inward like an invitation rather than an exit, and above it, a larger symbol was carved deeper into the rock, repeating the same motif he had followed since the river. He stepped closer, and as he did, the carved horse in his hand seemed to align perfectly with the symbol above the entrance, creating a sense of completion that settled over the entire space. The ranch hand spoke again, asking quietly if Luke believed this was still about disappearance, but Luke now understood that disappearance had never been the correct word, because nothing about this journey suggested loss or chaos. Instead, everything pointed toward structure, intention, and communication designed to be discovered only by someone who would not turn back. Luke stood at the threshold of the final opening, looking into the deeper passage beyond, and in that moment he realized that every trail, every symbol, every silent absence had been leading not to an end, but to an understanding that the Apache tribe had not simply moved through the land, but had embedded their presence within it, leaving behind a message that could only be read by the one who was meant to find it. And Luke Mercer was now standing exactly where that message was meant to be. Understood. Luke Mercer stood motionless at the threshold of the final passage, the carved wooden horse still resting in his palm, and for the first time since entering the canyon, he felt not guided forward by curiosity, but held in place by the weight of understanding slowly forming around him. Behind him, the ranch hand remained silent now, no longer questioning, only watching as Luke stepped through the opening into a wider space, where the canyon finally opened like a hidden room carved by time itself. The air inside this chamber was still, but not empty, carrying a quiet order that felt intentional, as if every stone, every shadow, every line of light had been arranged for recognition rather than discovery. Luke's boots pressed softly into the ground as he moved forward, and immediately he noticed that the floor of the chamber was not natural in its pattern. Faint grooves ran across the earth in long intersecting paths, forming a map that only revealed itself when viewed from above or understood from within. The carved symbols he had been following now appeared everywhere, not scattered but connected, forming a complete language that stretched across the chamber floor and up into the surrounding rock walls. Luke slowly lowered himself to one knee, placing the wooden horse at the center of one of the intersecting lines, and at that exact moment, the alignment of symbols around him seemed to shift in meaning rather than form, as if his presence confirmed something already prepared. The ranch hand stepped in cautiously behind him, stopping just inside the entrance, his eyes scanning the chamber with growing confusion. But Luke did not turn because his focus had already locked onto the far wall, where a larger formation of markings formed a complete circular pattern broken only at a single point. That opening in the circle pointed toward a narrow slit of light descending from above, and beneath it lay a series of objects arranged in careful sequence: fabric strips, carved stones, and faint impressions in the dust that suggested repeated visits over time, each one adding to the structure rather than disturbing it. Luke rose slowly, moving closer to the circular formation, and as he did, he realized that the pattern was not simply symbolic, but functional, marking time, movement, and direction in a way that replaced spoken explanation entirely. The ranch hand finally spoke again, his voice quiet, saying that no group could maintain such precision without discipline. But Luke now understood it was not discipline alone, but memory embedded into the land itself. As Luke approached the center of the formation, he noticed something new, a final set of markings that had not been visible until he stood directly within the chamber, lines that only aligned when viewed from this exact position, forming a complete path that pointed toward the upper ridge beyond the chamber walls. And in that moment, Luke realized that everything he had followed before had only been preparation, each symbol guiding him not toward a location, but toward a perspective. The carved wooden horse in his hand now felt like part of a larger sequence, no longer an object, but a confirmation that he had reached the point of understanding. The ranch hand moved a step closer, asking if this meant the Apache tribe had been here recently, but Luke did not answer immediately because the question no longer felt correct. Presence and absence had become irrelevant in the face of what he was seeing. Instead, what remained was structure, intention, and a message designed to exist beyond time, waiting for someone to arrive at the exact moment needed to comprehend it. Luke stood in the center of the chamber, looking up toward the final line of light cutting through the stone above, and as he traced its direction with his eyes, he understood that every step he had taken from the river to this hidden space had not been about tracking movement, but about being led into understanding. And what he was now beginning to realize was that the Apache tribe had not disappeared at all, but had transformed their absence into a language written across the land itself, one that only revealed its meaning when the right person finally learned how to see it. Luke Mercer remained standing at the center of the chamber long after the ranch hand had stopped moving behind him, and in that silence he felt something shift that was not in the land but in his understanding of it, as if the canyon had finally completed the act of speaking and now waited only to see if he had truly listened. The carved wooden horse in his hand no longer felt like a clue or a symbol, but like a final confirmation that every step he had taken since the empty Apache camp was part of a structure far larger than anything he had initially believed. He slowly raised his eyes toward the upper ridge where the narrow beam of light descended through the stone ceiling, and in that thin line of illumination, he noticed movement not of people appearing, but of meaning revealing itself, as if the canyon was aligning everything he had seen into a single coherent truth. The floor markings beneath him now formed a complete map when viewed from his position, and Luke realized that every intersection, every carved line, every placed object had been designed to converge here, not by accident, but by intention so precise it felt almost like communication across time rather than space. The ranch hand stepped closer again, his voice low and uncertain, asking what this place was supposed to be, but Luke did not answer immediately because the question itself no longer mattered in the same way it had before. What mattered now was that the absence they had been following was not emptiness, but direction. Luke walked slowly toward the center of the chamber where the symbols aligned most densely, and as he did, the light from above shifted slightly, revealing a final pattern embedded into the stone wall that had been hidden until this exact moment of alignment. It was not a warning or a boundary, but a continuation, extending the language beyond the chamber and pointing outward toward the distant ridges beyond the canyon. Luke felt a quiet pressure in his chest as he understood that the Apache tribe had constructed something far more advanced than simple trails or markers. They had created a system of presence without presence, a way of existing in the land that did not depend on staying in one place. The carved wooden horse in his hand suddenly felt lighter, as if its purpose had been fulfilled by reaching this chamber, and he placed it gently on the ground at the intersection of the central lines. The moment it touched the stone floor, Luke noticed that several of the surrounding markings appeared to complete themselves in relation to its position, forming a final layer of meaning that connected every previous site he had visited into one continuous path. The ranch hand now stood still, no longer asking questions, because even without full understanding he could sense that they were no longer in a place of searching, but in a place of realization. Luke turned slowly, scanning the chamber one final time, and what he saw was not evidence of disappearance, but evidence of continuity, as if every member of the tribe had contributed to a system that allowed their presence to be read only by someone who followed patiently enough to understand it. And as Luke Mercer looked toward the upper ridge where the light continued to fall in a single unwavering line, he understood that the silence he had been chasing was never absence at all, but a message carefully built into the land itself, waiting for the moment someone would finally see that the tribe had not vanished, but had chosen to speak only through the world they had always belonged to. Luke Mercer stood in silence at the center of the chamber long after the meaning of the place had begun to settle into him. And for the first time since entering the canyon, he was no longer searching for answers in the land around him, but recognizing that the land itself had already been speaking in a language he was only now capable of understanding. The ranch hand remained near the entrance, still and quiet, as if afraid that any movement might disturb something sacred in the air. Luke slowly looked upward one final time at the narrow beam of light cutting through the stone ceiling. And in that moment he understood that it was not just illumination, but a fixed point of alignment, a marker that tied everything he had seen together into one continuous truth. Every symbol, every carved line, every arranged object across the canyon was part of a single system, and this chamber was not the end of it, but the moment of comprehension. Luke exhaled slowly and stepped back toward the center, where the wooden horse now rested on the stone floor, no longer in his hand, but fully integrated into the pattern beneath him. As he looked around, he realized something deeper than structure or design. The Apache tribe had never been absent in the way he first believed. Their silence had not been disappearance, but translation, a way of removing themselves from sight while leaving behind a living map of intent. The ranch hand finally spoke again, his voice cautious, asking if Luke thought they would ever see the tribe itself. But Luke did not answer immediately because the question no longer held the same meaning. Instead, he walked slowly toward the far side of the chamber where the final alignment of symbols pointed outward through the canyon, and there he saw it clearly. The entire system converged not inward, but outward, extending beyond the chamber, beyond the canyon, into the wider land that stretched toward the horizon. Luke realized then that every step he had taken was not leading him to a hidden group, but guiding him through a method of understanding how that group chose to exist. They were not lost, not fleeing, not gone. They were present in a way that required awareness rather than pursuit. The ranch hand moved closer now, standing beside Luke as both of them looked toward the final direction indicated by the markings, and for the first time the silence between them was no longer confusion, but recognition. Luke felt the weight of everything he had followed begin to resolve into clarity, as if the canyon itself had completed its purpose. And as he stood there in the stillness of the chamber, he understood that what he had been tracking was never a disappearance at all, but a deliberate transformation of presence into language, a message written across land and stone for only one kind of observer to read. And in that final understanding, Luke Mercer realized that the Apache tribe had not vanished into the world, but had chosen to remain within it, hidden in plain sight, waiting only for someone patient enough to finally see them.